On February 28, 1900, after 118 days of starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment, the exhausted garrison of Ladysmith watched as columns of British cavalry rode through the siege lines and into the town. Soldiers who had survived on horse meat and scraps embraced their rescuers with tears streaming down hollow cheeks. Church bells that had been silent for months rang out across a town scarred by artillery fire. But this moment of jubilation had cost the British Empire dearly. Thousands of soldiers lay dead or wounded in the hills surrounding Ladysmith, casualties of some of the most brutal fighting the Empire had ever experienced. The Siege of Ladysmith had become a symbol of British vulnerability, a stark demonstration that even the world, as great as power, could be brought to its knees by determined citizen soldiers fighting for their independence. This is the story of how a small South African town became the focal point of an imperial crisis, and how its relief came at a price that shook the confidence of an empire. To understand why Ladysmith mattered so profoundly, we must first grasp its strategic importance in the opening moves of the Second Anglo-Boer War. Located in northern Natal, Ladysmith sat astride the main railway line connecting the coastal ports to the interior of South Africa. Control of this town meant control of the logistics that would sustain any military campaign in the region. When war erupted in October 1899, Ladysmith housed a substantial British garrison under the command of Lieutenant General Sir George White, a decorated veteran of campaigns across the Empire. White commanded approximately 13,000 troops, along with artillery, supplies, and the infrastructure necessary to project British power northward into the Boer republics. The Boers understood Ladysmith's significance as clearly as the British did. Within days of the war's outbreak, Boer commandos from both the Transvaal and the Orange Free State converged on northern Natal. These were the same farmers and frontiersmen who had already demonstrated their military capabilities in earlier skirmishes. Men who could ride all day and shoot with deadly accuracy, led by commanders who understood that conventional European military thinking could be turned against itself. The Boer plan was audacious. Instead of avoiding British strongholds and fighting a purely guerrilla campaign, they would pin down major British forces by besieging key towns. Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking would all be surrounded, forcing the British to mount costly relief operations while Boer forces remained on the strategic offensive. General White, confident in British military superiority and eager to seize the initiative, made a decision that would doom his command to months of suffering. Rather than consolidating his forces within Ladysmith's defences and waiting for reinforcements, he chose to engage the advancing Boer forces in the field. On October 30th, 1899, White launched an ambitious operation aimed at catching the Boers in a pincer movement near the town of Ladysmith. The resulting Battle of Lombard's Kop, also called the Battle of Mournful Monday, became a catastrophic defeat that set the stage for everything that followed. White's plan called for multiple columns to advance simultaneously, enveloping the Boer positions from several directions. On paper, it was the sort of coordinated maneuver that European armies executed routinely. In practice, against an enemy who refused to fight according to European conventions, it fell apart disastrously. The Boer commandos, rather than standing their ground and trading volleys, used their superior mobility to avoid encirclement while concentrating overwhelming firepower against isolated British columns. British units found themselves under accurate long-range rifle fire from positions they couldn't even see clearly, delivered by men who seemed to materialize and vanish across the rocky landscape. The disaster reached its climax when a Royal Artillery battery of 6 guns pushed forward without adequate infantry support, attempting to bombard Boer positions. Boer marksmen systematically shot down the gun crews and their horses, then captured the entire battery intact. The loss of artillery to an enemy force was one of the most humiliating disasters that could befall a Victorian-era army, a disgrace that spoke to fundamental failures in command and tactics. White S columns staggered back toward Ladysmith, having suffered over 1,200 casualties and accomplished nothing beyond demonstrating Boer superiority in the field. This defeat sealed Ladysmith's fate. With Boer forces closing in from multiple directions and White's army bloodied and demoralized, there would be no further attempts at offensive operations. By the first week of November, Boer commandos had completely encircled the town, cutting the railway lines and establishing artillery positions on the commanding heights surrounding Ladysmith. The siege had begun, and 13,000 British soldiers, along with thousands of civilians, were trapped. The Boer forces conducting the siege were commanded by some of their most capable leaders. General Pieter, the overall Boer commander in Natal, coordinated operations, while men like Louis Botha, who would later become the first Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, commanded individual commando units. These leaders faced a unique challenge. Their citizen soldiers were superb in mobile operations and defensive fighting, but siegecraft required patience and sustained commitment. Boer commandos were accustomed to riding home between operations to tend their farms. Keeping them concentrated around Ladysmith for months would test Boer resolve as much as British endurance. The Boers established their siege lines methodically, positioning artillery on hills with commanding views of the town. They had brought up heavy guns, including modern French-made Creusot artillery pieces that could hurl shells weighing nearly 100 pounds across vast distances. These long toms, as the British called them, began a systematic bombardment of Ladysmith that would continue for the entire duration of the siege. The psychological impact of this shelling was immense. No place in town was truly safe. Shells crashed into buildings without warning, killing soldiers and civilians alike. The British had no effective counter-battery fire initially, as their own artillery couldn't match the range of the Boer guns positioned on the heights. Inside Ladysmith, General White faced the grim mathematics of siege warfare. He had thousands of mouths to feed with finite supplies, limited medical resources for the sick and wounded, and no clear timeline for when relief might arrive. His first priority was establishing a defensive perimeter that could resist Boer attacks while conserving manpower. British troops dug trenches and constructed fortifications on the hills immediately surrounding the town, creating an inner defensive ring that would make any Boer assault costly. But these positions themselves came under artillery fire, and manning them exposed soldiers to both shells and the increasingly accurate fire of Boer sharpshooters. The civilian population of Ladysmith added another layer of complexity. Thousands of non-combatants, including women and children, were trapped in the siege. They required food, shelter, and protection from bombardment, but they contributed nothing to the defense. White established refugee camps and attempted to organize the distribution of supplies. But as the siege wore on, the presence of so many civilians would strain resources to the breaking point. The Boers made their most serious attempt to take Ladysmith by assault in early January 1900, an operation that demonstrated both their courage and the limitations of their military organization. On the night of January 6th, Boer commandos launched a coordinated attack against the British positions on Platrond, a ridge immediately south of the town. If they could seize this high ground, their artillery could dominate the entire town and the British position would become untenable. The attack began in darkness, with Boer fighters advancing up steep slopes toward British trenches. What followed was some of the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the entire war. The British defenders, Men of the Imperial Light Horse and other colonial units fought desperately to hold their positions. The battle raged through the night and into the following day, with neither side willing to yield. Boer commandos reached the British trenches in several places, fighting hand-to-hand with bayonets and rifle butts. British reinforcements rushed to plug gaps in the line, while Boer commanders tried to exploit any breakthrough. The fighting on Platrund, particularly on the feature known as Wagon Hill, involved extraordinary bravery on both sides and staggering casualties given the relatively small numbers engaged. The British ultimately held their positions, but at terrible cost. Over 400 British soldiers were killed or wounded in the fighting, and Boer casualties, though never precisely counted, were also significant. For the Boers, this repulse marked the end of serious attempts to take Ladysmith by storm. The citizen soldiers who made up the commandos were willing to risk their lives in defense of their republics, and in mobile operations where their skills gave them advantages. But they had no appetite for suicidal assaults against prepared positions. The siege would continue, but it would be a matter of bombardment, blockade, and waiting for starvation or disease to do what direct assault could not. As weeks turned into months, conditions inside Ladysmith deteriorated rapidly. Food became the dominant concern. White had stockpiled supplies before the siege tightened, but feeding 13,000 soldiers and thousands of civilians drained reserves with terrifying speed. Rations were cut repeatedly. Meat supplies ran low, and the garrison began slaughtering the cavalry horses and transport animals. Horse meat became a staple of the diet, an indignity that Victorian soldiers found degrading but necessary. Even horse meat eventually became scarce, and rations shrank to starvation levels. Soldiers received a handful of biscuits and a thin soup each day, barely enough to sustain life and wholly inadequate for men performing hard physical labor in defensive positions. Disease proved even deadlier than Boer shells. Typhoid fever swept through the crowded garrison, thriving in the unsanitary conditions created by thousands of people confined in a small area with inadequate sewerage and contaminated water supplies. Dysentery followed, then other illnesses born of malnutrition and filth. The military hospital overflowed with sick and wounded. Men died not gloriously in combat, but miserably in hospital tents, their bodies racked with fever and intestinal agony. By the end of the siege, disease had killed far more British soldiers than Boer bullets or shells. The psychological toll was equally severe. The constant bombardment, the hunger, the sickness, the uncertainty about when or whether relief would come, all of this ground down morale. Soldiers who had enlisted to fight found themselves instead enduring passive suffering, unable to strike back effectively at an enemy who bombarded them from beyond reach. Some men broke mentally, succumbing to what would later be called shell shock. Others clung to hope, to rumors of relief columns advancing, to faith that the Empire would not abandon them. Outside Ladysmith, the British were indeed mounting relief operations. But these efforts would prove almost as costly as the siege itself. General Sir Redvers Buller, commanding British forces in Natal, had orders to break through to Ladysmith and raise the siege. Buller was a cautious commander, aware of how earlier British overconfidence had led to disasters like Magersfontein and Colenso. He understood that the Boer positions between his forces and Ladysmith were formidable, defended by commandos fighting from high ground with clear fields of fire. But political pressure from London and humanitarian concern for the besieged garrison demanded action. Buller's first major attempt to relieve Ladysmith came in mid-December 1899 at the Battle of Colenso. His plan called for a frontal assault across the Tugela River against Boer positions on the heights beyond. The attack became another catastrophic British defeat, with Buller's forces suffering over 1,100 casualties and failing to establish even a toehold across the river. Artillery was lost, including guns from the same battery that had suffered disgrace at Lombard's Kop, compounding the humiliation. Colenso joined Stormberg and Magersfontein as the third disaster of Black Week, convincing London that the South African situation had spiraled into crisis. Buller made additional attempts to break through in January 1900, fighting costly battles at Spion Kop and Vaal Krantz. Spion Kop, in particular, became legendary for its horror and futility. British forces seized the summit of a dominating hill, only to discover they were exposed to devastating artillery and rifle fire from surrounding heights. The battle devolved into a nightmare of bombardment and close-range firefighting, with soldiers crowding into inadequate trenches while shells and bullets tore through their ranks. The British ultimately abandoned the position, having suffered over 1,700 casualties in an operation that achieved nothing. Each failed relief attempt sent shockwaves through the British Empire and the world beyond. Newspapers published casualty lists that stunned the British public. Political opponents questioned the competence of military leadership and the wisdom of the war itself. Internationally, rivals and competitors watched Britain's struggles with satisfaction and concern. The Siege of Ladysmith had become a test of British will and capability, a public demonstration of whether the Empire could overcome a determined foe that refused to fight according to European rules. Inside Ladysmith, the garrison received occasional news of relief attempts through messenger and heliograph signals, but each failure was a psychological blow, compounding their physical suffering. Men who had endured weeks of bombardment and starvation, hoping for rescue now, faced the possibility that help might never arrive, that they might be forced to surrender or simply starve to death. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and morale among troops who grew weaker and more despondent with each passing day. The situation grew so desperate that White considered attempting a breakout, ordering his mobile forces to smash through the Boer lines while abandoning the wounded and civilians to their fate. Such an operation would have been militarily desperate and politically catastrophic, an admission that the garrison was defeated and could only save some fragment of itself through abandonment of the rest. White ultimately rejected this option, but the fact that it was seriously considered illustrated how dire circumstances had become. Relief finally came through a combination of British persistence and evolving Boer weaknesses. General Buller, reinforced with additional troops and having learned painful lessons from his earlier failures, mounted a more carefully planned offensive in mid-February 1900, rather than attempting frontal assaults against the strongest Boer positions. He maneuvered his forces to find weaknesses in the siege lines. The battles of Vaal Krantz and Tugela Heights involved careful coordination of artillery, infantry, and cavalry, with British forces grinding forward through determined fighting rather than attempting the spectacular breakthrough that had failed so catastrophically before. The Boers, meanwhile, faced mounting problems of their own. Months of siege duty had worn down the morale of commandos eager to return to their farms. Supplies of artillery ammunition were running low, limiting the effectiveness of the bombardment that had made life so miserable for the garrison. Most critically, the Boer commandos could not match the sustained reinforcement that the British Empire could pour into South Africa. Buller's army grew stronger as fresh troops arrived from Britain and across the Empire, while Boer numbers dwindled as men drifted away or were drawn to other threatened sectors. By late February, the Boer positions around Ladysmith had become untenable. Buller's forces had pushed across the Tugela and were systematically driving back the siege lines. Boer commanders, recognizing that they lacked the strength to both resist Buller's advance and maintain the siege, made the decision to abandon their positions and withdraw. On February 28th, the siege was lifted as British cavalry rode into Ladysmith and Boer commandos melted away into the landscape. The scenes in Ladysmith that day were both joyous and heartbreaking. The relief column was greeted by skeletal soldiers who could barely stand, men who had lost 40 or 50 pounds over the course of the siege. The town itself bore the scars of months of bombardment, with buildings collapsed or riddled with shell fragments. The hospitals overflowed with the sick and dying, men who had survived the siege only to succumb to disease in its final days. Even as celebrations erupted, doctors and burial parties worked to care for the dying and bury the dead. The casualties tell the story of the siege more eloquently than any narrative. Of the 13,000 soldiers trapped in Ladysmith, nearly 1,000 had been killed in action or died of wounds. But over 3,000 had died of disease, primarily typhoid and dysentery. Another 7,000 had been sick at some point during the siege, many of them permanently weakened. The garrison that emerged from Ladysmith was a shadow of the force that had entered it, requiring months of recovery before its survivors could return to active service. The cost of relief was equally staggering. Buller's attempts to break through to Ladysmith had cost over 7,000 British casualties across multiple battles. When combined with the losses inside the siege, the British Empire had sacrificed over 10,000 soldiers to hold and relieve a single town in a colonial war. The strategic value of Ladysmith, while real, could not fully justify such losses. The siege had been sustained as much by political and psychological necessity as military logic. Britain could not afford to be seen abandoning a besieged garrison. The Empire's credibility depended on demonstrating that it would rescue its soldiers regardless of cost. For the Boers, the Siege of Ladysmith represented both an achievement and a missed opportunity. They had successfully besieged a major British force for nearly 4 months, tying down troops that could otherwise have been used offensively and inflicting enormous casualties on relief forces. The siege had contributed directly to Black Week and the broader crisis of British confidence, but the Boers had lacked the resources to capitalize on their success. They couldn't take Ladysmith by storm, and they couldn't prevent British reinforcements from eventually overwhelming the siege lines. The commandos that withdrew from Ladysmith in late February had fought brilliantly and endured hardship, but their strategic situation was deteriorating. The relief of Ladysmith marked a turning point in the Second Boer War, though not its conclusion. With Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking all relieved by early March 1900, the British could finally go on the offensive. New commanders, including Field Marshal Lord Roberts, brought fresh energy and evolving tactics that began to counter Boer advantages. The war would continue for more than 2 years, degenerating into a bitter guerrilla conflict marked by British scorched earth, tactics, and the establishment of concentration camps for Boer civilians. But after Ladysmith, the strategic initiative belonged to Britain, and the ultimate outcome, however delayed and costly, was no longer seriously in doubt. The siege left lessons that military professionals studied for generations. It demonstrated the vulnerability of static positions to modern artillery and the devastating impact of disease in siege conditions. It showed that Victorian-era tactics remained dangerously obsolete against determined defenders with modern weapons. The relief operations illustrated the importance of coordinated combined arms, warfare, and the futility of frontal assaults against prepared positions. British officers who survived Ladysmith and its relief carried those lessons forward. Though tragically, many of the same mistakes would be repeated on an even more catastrophic scale in the trenches of the First World War. On a human level, the Siege of Ladysmith represented extraordinary endurance in the face of suffering. The soldiers who survived months of bombardment, starvation, and disease demonstrated resilience that commands respect regardless of the politics of the war. The Boer commandos who maintained a siege against a numerically superior enemy for nearly 4 months showed dedication to their cause and remarkable military skill. And the civilians, trapped in Ladysmith, enduring all the horrors of the siege without the solidarity of military units or the comfort of believing their suffering served a military purpose, displayed a fortitude that history has largely forgotten. When we reflect on the siege and relief of Ladysmith, more than a century later, we see an event that transcended its immediate military significance. It became a symbol of British vulnerability and resilience, a demonstration that even the world's greatest empire could be brought to the brink of humiliation by a small nation fighting for its independence. The 118 days that Ladysmith endured tested British resolve as much as any battle, and the costly relief operations demonstrated the lengths to which the empire would go to avoid the political catastrophe of abandonment. The church bells that rang across Ladysmith on February 28, 1900, celebrated survival more than victory. The garrison had endured, the relief had arrived, but the cost had been staggering and the war was far from over. Those bells also told for an era of imperial confidence that had been shattered by the realities of modern warfare. Against a determined, skilled enemy, the British Empire would eventually prevail in South Africa, but it would never again assume that flags, discipline, and courage alone could guarantee victory. The Siege of Ladysmith stands as a testament to human endurance under extreme conditions, to the evolution of warfare at the turn of the 20th century, and to the terrible costs of imperial ambition. The soldiers who starved in those trenches, who died from disease in those overcrowded hospitals, who fell attacking Boer positions in the desperate relief attempts, they paid the price for strategic miscalculation and tactical obsolescence. Their sacrifice bought Britain time to adapt, to learn, and ultimately to prevail. But the lessons were written in blood, and the ghosts of Ladysmith would haunt British military thinking for decades to come. The siege that nearly crushed the British Empire ultimately revealed both its fragility and its stubborn determination to survive, whatever the cost.